When did my competition with a rival go too far? The scholarship committee chair was asking me to explain the plagiarism allegations when my phone started buzzing with emergency notifications. I watched the color drain from Dr. Margaret Sutton's face as she read something on her tablet, and the way her eyes flicked between the screen and me told me this interview was over before it began. She slid the tablet across the mahogany table, and I saw my own words staring back at me, except they weren't my words at all. The essay was titled Perspectives on Economic Inequality in Rural Communities, and according to the metadata, I'd submitted it to 3 other scholarship competitions over the past 6 months. The problem was, I'd never written any essay with that title, never submitted applications to those other scholarships, and definitely never plagiarized a single word in my entire academic career. My hands went numb as I scrolled through the document, recognizing phrases and arguments I'd used in completely different contexts, stitched together into something that looked damning. Dr. Sutton's voice seemed to come from very far away as she explained that the Pemberton Scholarship valued integrity above all else, and given these serious allegations, my application was being withdrawn from consideration. The $500,000 full-ride scholarship I'd spent 4 years working toward had just evaporated, and I had no idea how it happened. I'd been competing with Zachary Thornton since freshman year when we both landed in advanced placement English and discovered we were the only 2 students who actually cared about grades. Zachary was the kind of student teachers loved at first, always prepared, always articulate, always staying after class to discuss the finer points of whatever we were studying. He wore expensive sweaters and had this confident way of speaking that made everything sound authoritative, even when he was clearly guessing. I was quieter, more methodical, the kid who did every extra credit assignment and spent lunch periods in the library. Our rivalry started innocently enough with competing for the highest grade on tests and essays, pushing each other to work harder. By sophomore year, we were the top 2 students in our class of 380, trading the number 1 spot back and forth depending on the semester. Teachers would joke about our competition, and I'd always laugh it off, but I could see something in Zachary's eyes when I pulled ahead that suggested he took it more personally than I did. Junior year brought AP exams, leadership positions, and the start of college preparation, and that's when things shifted from friendly competition to something darker. The first incident happened in November of junior year during the academic decathlon state qualifier. I'd prepared for weeks, memorizing facts and practicing the essay portion until I could construct arguments in my sleep. Zachary was team captain, and I was vice captain, positions we'd campaigned for with the intensity of actual political candidates. The night before the competition, I'd left my study materials in my locker since we were leaving early the next morning from school. When I arrived at 6:30 in the morning, my locker had been opened and my binder was missing. Just gone, with no sign of forced entry even though I knew I'd locked it. I reported it to Mr. Fairchild, our team coach, but he seemed to think I'd just misplaced it in my pre-competition stress. Without my materials, I had to rely purely on memory during the competition, and while I still placed 3rd in the essay category, Zachary took 1st. He'd given this flawless performance that seemed oddly familiar, and only later did I realize he'd hit several of the same key points I'd outlined in my missing notes. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was coincidence, that Zachary wouldn't actually steal my materials, but something nagging in the back of my mind kept insisting otherwise. The second incident was harder to dismiss. I'd been working for months on an independent research project about watershed management in our region, conducting interviews with environmental scientists and compiling data I'd collected from local streams. The project was supposed to be presented at the Regional Science Symposium, and first place came with a $10,000 scholarship. I'd submitted my proposal in January and been accepted, one of only 30 students selected from hundreds of applicants. 3 days before my scheduled presentation, I received an email from the symposium coordinator saying my project had been withdrawn due to concerns about data authenticity. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint claiming I'd fabricated my water quality measurements and falsified interview transcripts. I had to provide my raw data, my field notebooks, copies of my email correspondence with the scientists I'd interviewed, everything to prove I'd actually done the work. The review process took 2 weeks, and while I was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, I'd missed the symposium presentation window. Zachary had presented his project, something about renewable energy applications, and won 2nd place. When I asked who'd filed the complaint, the coordinator said it had come through an anonymous tip line and they couldn't disclose the source. But I knew. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. Senior year started with both of us locked in a dead heat for valedictorian. Our GPAs were identical down to the 3rd decimal place, which meant everything came down to this final year. Whichever one of us finished with the higher GPA would give the graduation speech, get the title, and have that distinction on college applications and scholarship submissions. The stakes felt impossibly high because we were both competing for the same elite scholarships, the kind that were full rides to top universities. The Pemberton Scholarship was the most prestigious, a full $500,000 package that covered tuition, room, board, and included funding for graduate school. Only one student from our state won it each year, and the selection process was brutal. Perfect grades weren't enough. You needed exceptional extracurriculars, leadership experience, community impact, and a flawless interview. Both Zachary and I had made it to the final round of 3 candidates, which meant we were directly competing for the same prize. The third candidate was a girl named Olivia from a school 2 hours north, and while she was impressive, the committee seemed most interested in the rivalry between Zachary and me. They'd even mentioned in our preliminary interviews that having 2 candidates from the same school was unusual and demonstrated the academic caliber of our institution. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The sabotage escalated throughout the fall in ways that were increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. In September, I discovered someone had hacked my student email account and sent inflammatory messages to several teachers, including one to Mrs. Kelsey accusing her of playing favorites. I had to spend hours proving I hadn't sent those emails, showing the IP addresses didn't match my devices, and even then, some teachers looked at me differently afterward. In October, my name was mysteriously added to a list of students caught using their phones during the SAT, which required another round of proving my innocence and sitting for a makeup exam. In November, someone posted screenshots of what appeared to be me offering to write essays for money on a local social media group. The screenshots were convincing enough that the school launched an investigation, and I had to provide access to all my devices and accounts to demonstrate I'd never been involved in academic dishonesty. Each incident ate up time and energy I should have been spending on applications and schoolwork, and each time I noticed Zachary watching with this expression, I couldn't quite read. Not quite sympathy, not quite satisfaction, something in between that made my skin crawl. The pattern became undeniable when I started documenting everything. I created a spreadsheet tracking each incident, the timing, who might have had access to the information needed to pull it off, and what I'd been working on when it happened. The correlation was striking. Every time I completed something significant, an application, a project, a competition entry, something would go wrong within a week. The anonymous complaints, the hacked accounts, the framing attempts, they all happened at moments that would cause maximum disruption to my academic trajectory. I took screenshots, saved emails, backed everything up to multiple cloud services because I was terrified someone would try to destroy the evidence. I showed my documentation to my parents, and while my dad thought I was becoming paranoid, my mom said to trust my instincts. She worked in corporate law and had seen enough workplace sabotage to know the patterns were real. She suggested I keep a detailed log, change all my passwords, enable 2-factor authentication on everything, and consider installing security cameras in my room. The fact that I needed to treat my own bedroom like a crime scene just to protect my academic work felt insane, but I did it anyway. The camera caught nothing unusual, but it gave me peace of mind, knowing I had evidence of my own activities. The crisis really began in late January, when I submitted my Pemberton scholarship application. I'd spent 6 months crafting the perfect submission package, essays that showcase my growth and goals, letters of recommendation from teachers who'd seen my development, documentation of my community service building a little free library network throughout our county. The application asked for our most significant written work, and I'd submitted an essay analyzing the intersection of education policy and economic mobility that I'd written for my AP government class. Mr. Fairchild had called it the best student work he'd seen in 20 years of teaching and had encouraged me to use it. I uploaded everything through the scholarship portal, triple-checked that all components were included, and submitted it 3 days before the deadline to avoid any technical issues. The confirmation email arrived immediately, and I felt this wave of relief that I'd actually completed the application without any sabotage attempts interfering. That feeling lasted exactly 5 days before I got the call from Dr. Sutton, requesting an emergency interview to discuss irregularities in my application. The interview was supposed to be a formality, a final conversation before they made their decision between me, Zachary, and Olivia. Instead, I walked into an ambush. Dr. Sutton was joined by 2 other committee members, neither of whom made eye contact when I entered the room. She started by asking if I was familiar with the scholarship's integrity policy, which should have been my first warning that something was catastrophically wrong. Then came the accusations. According to their research, the essay I'd submitted as my original work had been previously published under a different author's name on an obscure academic blog 2 years ago. Furthermore, they'd discovered I'd submitted nearly identical applications to 3 other scholarship programs under different essay titles, suggesting a pattern of recycling work to maximize my chances. The evidence was compelling because it was real. Those documents existed with my name attached, but I'd never created them. Someone had taken my actual work, my actual writing, and manipulated it to look like plagiarism and fraud. When I tried to explain this, Dr. Sutton's expression made it clear she'd heard similar denials from dishonest students before. She gave me 72 hours to provide evidence of my innocence or accept the withdrawal of my application with a notation of academic dishonesty. I walked out of that interview in a state of shock so complete I could barely process what had happened. My phone was buzzing constantly with text messages, and when I finally looked, I saw they were from other students asking if it was true I'd been caught cheating. Someone had leaked the allegations to the school's social media ecosystem, and now my entire senior class was debating whether I was actually the fraud Zachary had been claiming I was all along. That last part hit me like a physical blow. Zachary had been claiming I was a fraud. I scrolled through the messages and found screenshots of conversations where Zachary had expressed concern about my integrity to other students, suggesting he'd noticed inconsistencies in my work, implying he'd seen signs of dishonesty he'd been too polite to mention. The smear campaign had been running in the background while I'd been focused on applications and schoolwork, poisoning the well before the accusations even became public. I drove home instead of going back to school and locked myself in my room, staring at my computer screen and trying to figure out how to prove a negative. How do you prove you didn't do something when evidence says you did? My mom came home early from work after I called her in tears, unable to articulate what had happened beyond saying my entire future had just been destroyed. She sat with me while I showed her the emails from Dr. Sutton, the documents claiming to be mine, the social media firestorm already brewing. Her lawyer brain kicked in immediately, and she started making calls. First to the school principal, Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, to understand what exactly was being alleged and what process existed for defending against these claims. Dr. Whitmore was sympathetic but firm, explaining that academic integrity violations were taken extremely seriously and that I'd need to provide substantial evidence to refute the documentation the scholarship committee had found. My mom then called a colleague who specialized in educational law, an attorney named Julia Brennan, who'd handled several cases involving false allegations against students. Attorney Brennan agreed to review the evidence that evening and advise on next steps. While my mom made calls, I started my own investigation, pulling up every draft of every essay I'd ever written, every saved version with timestamps, every email where I'd discussed my work with teachers. If someone had framed me, they'd had to use my actual words, which meant there'd be a trail showing when I'd actually written them. The digital forensics took hours, but patterns started emerging. The essay, allegedly published on the academic blog 2 years ago, contained paragraphs from 3 different papers I'd written during junior year. Someone had stitched them together to create a coherent piece, then backdated the blog post to make it look like I'd plagiarized from it, when in reality I'd written the original components. The applications to other scholarships showed similar manipulation, taking excerpts from my legitimate work and repackaging them as separate submissions. I had draft versions of all my essays saved in Google Docs with complete revision histories showing when each sentence was written. The timestamps proved I'd created the content during junior year, while the blog post claiming to be the original was dated 6 months after my earliest drafts. Attorney Brennan reviewed my documentation at 9 that evening and said I had a solid defense, but we needed to understand how someone had gained access to my work to create these forgeries. That meant figuring out where my essays had been stored and who could have accessed them. The answer made my stomach drop when I realized it. Mr. Fairchild, my trusted AP government teacher, kept digital copies of outstanding student work in a shared department folder that all social studies teachers could access for curriculum development purposes. Any teacher in the department could have opened that folder and found my essays, but teachers weren't my competition. Zachary was, and Zachary didn't have access to the teacher's shared folders, unless someone had given him access or he'd gained it through other means. I thought back to all the times I'd seen Zachary staying after school, chatting with teachers, volunteering to help grade papers or organize materials. He'd been student aide for Mrs. Kelsey's second period this year, which meant he'd had unsupervised access to her classroom and her computer. I pulled up the staff directory and confirmed that Mrs. Kelsey taught honors world history, which meant she was part of the social studies department, which meant her computer could access the shared folder. The pieces were falling into place, but I needed proof, not just circumstantial evidence and speculation. Attorney Brennan suggested we request a meeting with Dr. Whitmore to present my evidence and request a formal investigation into how the fraudulent documents were created. She drafted a formal letter outlining the timeline, the digital evidence I'd compiled, and the request for the school to examine their network logs to determine who'd accessed the teacher's shared folders containing my work. My mom hand-delivered the letter to Dr. Whitmore's office first thing the next morning along with a flash drive containing all my documentation. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Dr. Whitmore called an emergency meeting for that afternoon with me, my parents, Attorney Brennan, the school's IT director, and surprisingly, a police detective. Detective Raymond Cooper had apparently been contacted by the school after receiving my evidence, because if someone had hacked into school systems to frame a student, that constituted computer fraud and identity theft, both criminal offenses. Detective Cooper was probably in his early 50s with gray hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of deception humans could create. He listened while Attorney Brennan presented my case, examined my digital evidence, and asked pointed questions about the timeline. The IT director, a nervous man named Gerald Foster, pulled up logs from the department's shared folders and went pale when he saw the access history. Someone had logged into Mrs. Kelsey's account multiple times over the past 6 months, always during her second period class when she had a student aide, and had accessed the folder containing my essays exactly 12 times. The most recent access was 2 weeks ago, right before the fraudulent documents appeared in the scholarship committee's investigation. Detective Cooper asked who Mrs. Kelsey's student aide was, and Dr. Whitmore confirmed what I already knew. Zachary Thornton, second period, all semester. The investigation shifted into high gear after that meeting. Detective Cooper obtained a warrant to examine Zachary's school-issued laptop and personal devices, citing probable cause based on the access logs and the timing of the incidents. Mrs. Kelsey was called in and questioned about whether she'd given Zachary her login credentials, and she admitted with obvious distress that he'd asked to use her computer several times to check his grades and email, and she'd trustingly allowed it while she supervised. She'd never imagined he was accessing confidential student files. The warrant execution happened the next day during third period. I was in calculus when I heard the commotion in the hallway, and through the classroom door window, I saw Zachary being escorted to the principal's office by Detective Cooper and a uniformed officer. His expensive messenger bag was being carried separately, sealed in an evidence bag. The classroom went silent, and everyone pulled out their phones to check what was happening. Within minutes, rumors were flying that Zachary had been arrested, though that turned out to be premature. He was being detained for questioning while they secured his devices, but no charges had been filed yet. The forensic analysis of Zachary's laptop took 3 days, and what they found was damning beyond anything I'd imagined. He'd saved copies of my essays, along with essays from 6 other top students at our school, in a folder labeled Competition Research. The metadata showed when he'd accessed each file, and the timestamps corresponded exactly with when various sabotage incidents had occurred. But that was just the beginning. They found draft versions of the fraudulent blog post that framed me for plagiarism, complete with instructions he'd written to himself about how to backdate posts using website manipulation tools. They found emails he'd sent from burner accounts filing anonymous complaints about my science project, my academic decathlon materials, everything. There were screenshots of my social media that he'd edited to create the fake posts about essay writing services. Most disturbingly, they found a spreadsheet tracking my competition performances, my scholarship applications, my GPA by semester, with notes about what interventions he'd planned to keep me from pulling ahead. The document was titled Maintaining Position, and reading through it made me physically ill. This wasn't spontaneous rivalry gone wrong. This was calculated, systematic sabotage that had been going on for nearly 2 years. Detective Cooper called me in for a formal statement once they'd documented everything. He explained that Zachary was being charged with multiple felonies including computer fraud, identity theft, filing false police reports regarding the previous anonymous complaints, and harassment. Because some of the activities had impacted federally funded scholarship programs, there were potential federal charges as well. The district attorney, a woman named Teresa Vaughn, was reviewing the case to determine the full scope of charges. Detective Cooper asked me to walk through every incident I could remember, every time something had gone wrong, every accusation I'd faced. I pulled out my spreadsheet, the documentation I'd been keeping, and we spent 4 hours going through everything. He kept shaking his head and saying he'd seen corporate espionage cases with less sophisticated operations than what Zachary had orchestrated. When we finished, he told me that Zachary had already confessed to most of it after being confronted with the evidence from his laptop. He'd claimed he'd never meant for things to go this far, that it had started as just checking on his competition and spiraled into something he couldn't control. Detective Cooper's expression made it clear he didn't buy that explanation for a second. The school's response was swift and severe. Dr. Whitmore called an assembly the next day to address what she called a serious breach of academic integrity and student trust. She didn't name Zachary directly, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She announced that a student had been suspended pending criminal charges and expulsion proceedings related to systematic academic fraud and harassment. She also apologized to any students who'd been impacted by false allegations, looking directly at me when she said it. The vindication should have felt good, but instead, I just felt exhausted. The scholarship committee was another matter. Dr. Sutton called personally to apologize for doubting me and to explain that my application was being reinstated and the fraudulent evidence removed from consideration. She said the committee would be conducting their own investigation into how Zachary's manipulated documents had ended up in their research, and they'd be implementing new verification procedures. She also mentioned that Zachary's application had been permanently withdrawn, and he was being reported to the National Scholarship Database to prevent him from applying to other programs. That meant, even if he somehow avoided jail time, his academic future was effectively over. The hardest part was watching it all unfold publicly. The local news picked up the story because a private school student being charged with felony fraud to secure college scholarships was apparently newsworthy. They didn't use our names because we were minors, but our school was small enough that everyone in town knew exactly who they were talking about. Zachary's parents hired an expensive criminal defense attorney, a man named Richard Davison, who immediately started talking about mental health issues and the pressure of academic competition. He gave an interview suggesting that elite schools created unhealthy competitive environments that drove students to desperate measures. My mom fired back through Attorney Brennan with a statement pointing out that thousands of students handled academic pressure without resorting to felony fraud, and attempting to blame the system ignored Zachary's deliberate, calculated choices. The court of public opinion was firmly on my side, which was a new experience after months of having my integrity questioned. Other students started coming forward with their own stories about Zachary. things he'd done that hadn't seemed suspicious at the time, but now revealed a pattern of manipulation and sabotage. Nathan, who'd been competing for a different scholarship, discovered that his application had been withdrawn due to missing documents that had definitely been included in his submission. Grant found out that a college he'd been accepted to had received an anonymous tip about his disciplinary record, except he'd never had any disciplinary issues. The anonymous tip had come from an IP address that forensics traced back to Zachary's home network. Olivia, the third Pemberton finalist, told investigators that she'd received strange emails during the application process, warning her that the competition was rigged in favor of our school and suggesting she withdraw. The emails had encouraged her to pursue other opportunities and made her doubt whether she had a real chance of winning. She'd almost withdrawn until her counselor talked her out of it. Each revelation added to the case against Zachary, building a picture of someone who'd weaponized the entire scholarship and college application process against anyone he perceived as competition. The scope of what he'd done was staggering, affecting at least 9 different students across multiple schools and scholarship programs. The criminal proceedings moved faster than I expected. Zachary's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal that would avoid prison time, but District Attorney Vaughn wasn't having it. She'd built a career on prosecuting white-collar crime and saw Zachary's case as a clear example of privileged students thinking rules didn't apply to them. The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out, and Zachary was released to house arrest with electronic monitoring while awaiting trial. He'd been expelled from our school officially, and his parents had reportedly enrolled him in online homeschooling to finish his senior year. The Pemberton Scholarship Committee moved forward with their selection process, and 3 weeks after the investigation became public, I received a call from Dr. Sutton. She told me that after careful consideration of all 3 remaining candidates, the committee had selected me as this year's recipient. The $500,000 scholarship was mine, along with admission to my top choice university and funding for graduate school. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, I just felt hollow. I'd won, but only after having my integrity destroyed and rebuilt, only after months of fighting to prove I wasn't a fraud, only after watching someone I'd once considered a rival reveal himself as something far worse. The real satisfaction came 6 weeks later in the courtroom. Zachary's trial proceeded despite his attorney's attempts to delay, and I was called as a witness for the prosecution. District Attorney Vaughn walked me through the timeline of harassment, the impact each incident had on my academic performance and emotional well-being, and the documentation showing Zachary's systematic campaign. Zachary sat at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered, his expensive clothes replaced with a conservative suit that made him look like he was playing dress-up. His parents sat in the front row, and I could see his mother crying quietly. I felt a momentary flash of sympathy before remembering the spreadsheet titled Maintaining Position and the casual way he'd destroyed other students' opportunities for his own advancement. The prosecution presented their digital evidence, their access logs, their timeline of events. The defense tried to argue that Zachary had been under extreme pressure, that he'd made mistakes, but didn't deserve to have his future ruined. Judge Leonard Hartley listened to both sides, and then delivered a verdict that felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later brought closure I hadn't realized I needed. Judge Hartley spoke directly to Zachary about the seriousness of his crimes and the betrayal of trust involved in weaponizing the educational system against fellow students. He sentenced Zachary to 2 years in juvenile detention, followed by 3 years of probation. Additionally, Zachary would be required to complete 500 hours of community service, attend mandatory counseling, and was prohibited from applying to any college or university for 5 years. The financial restitution was significant as well. Zachary's family was ordered to pay $23,000 to cover the costs of my legal defense, forensic investigation, and counseling. They also had to pay restitution to 3 other students whose scholarship applications had been impacted. The judge made it clear that academic fraud wasn't a victimless crime and that Zachary's actions had real consequences for real people's futures. As the court officers led Zachary away to begin his sentence, he looked back at me once. I expected to see anger or resentment, but instead, I saw something that looked like resignation. He'd gambled everything on maintaining his position as the top student, and he'd lost not just the competition, but his entire future. The aftermath was surreal. I finished senior year as valedictorian by a significant margin once Zachary's fraudulent grade manipulations were corrected and his records adjusted. My graduation speech focused on integrity and the real meaning of academic achievement, themes that resonated differently given everything that had happened. The local paper ran a follow-up story about my Pemberton scholarship win, framing it as a triumphant ending after overcoming false accusations. Attorney Brennan used my case as an example in presentations about protecting students from academic sabotage and the importance of digital evidence in modern investigations. Dr. Whitmore implemented new security protocols for the school's shared folders and student information systems, recognizing that trusted positions could be exploited by determined bad actors. Most significantly, the regional scholarship community revised their verification processes to prevent similar fraud attempts in the future. Multiple programs now required original draft work with timestamps, direct verification with listed teachers, and cross-reference checking against databases of previously submitted work. College started in the fall with a freedom I hadn't felt in years. Without Zachary's shadow hanging over every achievement, I could actually enjoy learning instead of constantly looking over my shoulder. My roommate, a physics major named Elliot from Oregon, asked about the news stories he'd found when Googling my name, and I gave him the abbreviated version. He was appropriately horrified and impressed in equal measure. The Pemberton Scholarship covered everything the Financial Aid Office had promised, and I declared a double major in political science and computer science, inspired by my experience with both the legal system and digital forensics. Detective Cooper had suggested I consider cybersecurity as a career path, noting that I had good instincts for identifying patterns and protecting digital assets. The idea appealed to me, using what I'd learned from being targeted to help prevent others from experiencing similar attacks. My therapist, Dr. Monica Reeves, whom I'd started seeing during the investigation, said that finding purpose in trauma was a healthy way to process what I'd experienced. We met via video call now that I was at school, working through the lasting impacts of spending 2 years under systematic attack. The nightmares took longer to fade than I expected. I'd dream about discovering new accusations, about evidence that proved I'd actually done everything Zachary claimed, about scholarship committees rejecting me over and over. Dr. Reeves explained that hypervigilance was a common response to prolonged harassment and that my brain had spent so long in threat detection mode it needed time to recalibrate to safety. She taught me grounding techniques and helped me recognize when I was catastrophizing versus responding to actual threats. The work was ongoing, but gradually I started to trust that my achievements were mine, that my future was secure, that I could build something without someone systematically trying to tear it down. Sophomore year brought an unexpected development when I was contacted by a national education advocacy organization called Students Against Academic Sabotage. They'd read about my case and wanted me to speak at their annual conference about my experience and the reforms that resulted. The idea of sharing my story publicly was terrifying, but I agreed because maybe someone else dealing with similar harassment would benefit from knowing they weren't alone. The conference was in Chicago, and over 800 people attended my session. I talked about the escalation pattern, the importance of documentation, the necessity of involving authorities early rather than trying to handle everything privately. During the Q&A portion, dozens of students and parents shared their own experiences with academic sabotage, ranging from stolen projects to false accusations to systematic harassment. The commonality was striking. High-achieving students being targeted by rivals who saw success as a zero-sum game where someone else's loss was their gain. One parent told me their daughter had been accused of cheating by a competitor who'd hacked her computer and planted evidence. Another student described a years-long campaign of anonymous complaints filed against them by someone they'd once considered a friend. The organization's director, a woman named Claudia Northbrook, who'd founded the group after her own son was falsely accused, told me afterward that my willingness to speak publicly had given others permission to share their stories. She said, "Shame kept many victims silent, and visibility was essential for driving systemic change." I left Chicago feeling like the nightmare I'd lived through might actually serve a purpose beyond my own education. Junior year, I received a letter from Zachary. Prison authorities had apparently approved it after reviewing the contents to ensure it wasn't threatening or harassing. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on lined paper, and started with an apology that felt more genuine than anything he'd said during the trial. He acknowledged that he'd destroyed multiple people's lives, including his own, out of an obsessive need to be the best, to prove his worth through academic dominance. He described the therapy he was receiving in juvenile detention, the diagnosis of obsessive-compulsive disorder and anxiety that he'd been ignoring for years, the way competition had become his entire identity. He wrote that he understood if I never forgave him, but he wanted me to know that watching his life fall apart had forced him to confront the reality that his worth wasn't determined by his class rank or his scholarship wins. The letter ended with a request that I not respond, that this was for his own closure and healing rather than an attempt to rebuild any kind of relationship. I read it 3 times, showed it to Dr. Reeves, and then filed it away. I didn't forgive him, not really, but I understood better that hurt people, and Zachary had been breaking under pressure. I'd been too focused on my own stress to notice. Senior year brought unexpected closure when Olivia, the 3rd Pemberton finalist who'd won a different scholarship, reached out to reconnect. We'd lost touch after the investigation, and she was now at Stanford studying environmental policy. She told me she'd always wondered if she would have won the Pemberton if our school's drama hadn't eliminated Zachary and created sympathy for my situation. I appreciated her honesty and told her that I'd wondered the same thing, that winning under those circumstances would always carry an asterisk in my own mind. We talked about the bizarre pressure cooker of elite academic competition and how it brought out the worst in people who couldn't handle the possibility of failure. Olivia mentioned that Stanford had multiple students who'd transferred from other schools after being involved in various scandals, cheating rings, sabotage situations, all driven by the same desperate need to succeed at any cost. She'd joined a campus group focused on promoting healthy competition and mutual support, rather than zero-sum thinking. The conversation reminded me that Zachary wasn't an aberration, but rather an extreme example of a systemic problem in how we approached academic achievement and defined student worth. Graduation from college was different from high school. My parents attended along with Attorney Brennan, who'd become something of a family friend over the years. Dr. Whitmore sent a congratulatory card noting that I'd been an exemplary student who'd handled an impossible situation with grace and integrity. Detective Cooper, now retired, sent an email saying he'd followed my trajectory with interest and was glad to see I'd chosen cybersecurity consulting as my career path. My first job offer came from a firm specializing in educational technology security, helping schools protect student data and prevent the kind of exploitation Zachary had perpetrated. The irony wasn't lost on me, spending my career preventing others from experiencing what I'd endured. My starting project involved developing better authentication systems for shared teacher resources, ensuring that student aid positions couldn't be weaponized for unauthorized access. The work felt meaningful in a way I hadn't expected, turning personal trauma into systemic protection. 5 years after the trial, I received notification that Zachary had completed his juvenile detention sentence and was beginning his probation period. The notification was routine, part of the victim services program that kept me informed of his status. I looked him up online and found he'd completed his GED while in detention and was working at a nonprofit that helped at-risk youth. His social media presence was minimal and carefully curated, photos of community service events and motivational quotes about second chances. There was no mention of his academic past, no college plans, no indication of the ambitious student who'd once been my rival. I felt a strange mix of relief that he was apparently rebuilding his life in a healthier direction, and sadness for the futures we'd both lost to his choices. I'd gotten my scholarship and my degree, but the path had been scarred by years of harassment, and the knowledge that someone I'd respected had seen me as an obstacle to eliminate rather than a peer to compete alongside honestly. He'd lost everything he'd wanted and spent his formative late teen years in detention instead of at college. There were no real winners in what had happened, just different degrees of loss. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly 7 years after the initial incident. I was presenting at an educational technology conference about digital security in academic settings when someone in the audience asked about my personal experience with academic sabotage. I'd become more comfortable sharing my story over the years, treating it as a case study rather than a personal trauma. After my presentation, a young man approached me, probably early 20s, looking nervous. He introduced himself as someone who'd almost followed Zachary's path, engaging in minor sabotage against a rival before realizing where it would lead. He'd read about my case during his own period of competitive obsession and said it had scared him straight. Seeing the real consequences, the criminal charges, the destroyed futures, had made him step back and question what he was doing. He'd sought counseling instead, addressed his underlying anxiety about worth and achievement, and changed his approach to competition. He wanted to thank me for speaking publicly, because my visibility had likely prevented him from making decisions that would have ruined his life. Standing there listening to this stranger tell me how my worst experience had helped him avoid the same trap, I finally understood what Claudia Northbrook had meant about visibility serving a purpose. The nightmare I'd lived through had become a cautionary tale that might save others from similar fates. That didn't make what happened okay, or erase the years of stress and violation, but it meant something. It had to mean something. Walking out of that conference into the bright afternoon sun, I thought about the 17-year-old version of myself, sitting in that scholarship interview, watching his future crumble based on lies. I thought about Zachary, probably at his nonprofit job, living with the permanent consequences of his choices. I thought about all the students I'd met over the years who'd faced similar battles, fighting to prove their worth against systematic attempts to tear them down. The competition with Zachary had gone too far the moment he decided that my success somehow diminished his worth, that there wasn't room for both of us to succeed, that destroying me was an acceptable path to maintaining his position. But in the end, the only position he'd maintained was as a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition becomes pathology, when competition becomes obsession, when winning matters more than integrity. I'd spent years rebuilding from his attacks, but I'd rebuilt into someone stronger, more aware, more committed to preventing others from experiencing the same trauma. He'd spent years in detention and would spend the rest of his life with a felony record, barred from the academic future he'd once prioritized above all else. The rivalry was over, and the victory, if you could call it that, was simply surviving with my integrity intact. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.